The year was 1893. The city of Chicago was about to present itself to the world as a beacon of modern progress, human ingenuity, and architectural triumph. The world's Columbian Exposition, often referred to as the White City, was a dazzling display of neoclassical buildings, illuminated by the relatively new marvel of electrical light. Millions of people from across the globe traveled to the shores of Lake Michigan to witness the future. They came seeking inspiration, employment, and the promise of a new century. It was an era of unprecedented mobility. For the first time in American history, young men and women were leaving their rural hometowns in massive numbers, boarding trains, and arriving in booming metropolises to forge independent lives. But this massive influx of transient, hopeful individuals created an environment ripe for exploitation. Amidst the grandeur of the World's Fair, in a rapidly developing neighborhood on Chicago's South Side known as Englewood, a very different kind of structure was being built. It was not a monument to human achievement, but a sprawling labyrinthine building designed for deception, financial ruin, and ultimately, murder. The man responsible for this building is known to history as H. Holmes, but his story began under a different name. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett in New Hampshire. From an early age, Mudgett exhibited a high degree of intelligence combined with a profound lack of empathy. His path to becoming one of America's most notorious criminals was paved not by a sudden snap into violence, but through a calculated progression of fraud and manipulation. He attended the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, a prestigious institution where he gained a thorough understanding of human anatomy. More importantly, it was during his medical education that he discovered how easily the systems of life insurance and death certification could be manipulated. In the late 19th century, the protocols for verifying identity and cause of death were rudimentary compared to modern standards. Mudgett realized that a cadaver could be passed off as a deceased policyholder, yielding a substantial payout. This early realization that human life could be commodified and exploited for financial gain became the foundational principle of his criminal career. Fleeing various debts and early fraudulent schemes, Mudgett arrived in Chicago in the late 1880s and adopted the alias Henry Howard Holmes. The name change was a deliberate severing of his past, allowing him to present himself as a respectable, wealthy pharmacist and businessman. He took over a drugstore in Englewood, charming the local community with his articulate speech and professional demeanor. But Holmes possessed grander ambitions than running a corner pharmacy. He purchased an empty lot across the street and began constructing a massive 3-story block-long building that the neighborhood casually dubbed the Castle. To the outside observer, the building at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets was a legitimate commercial enterprise. The ground floor housed storefronts, including a new pharmacy, a jewelry counter, and a restaurant. Holmes advertised the upper floors as a hotel, specifically targeting the millions of tourists anticipated for the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition. However, the construction of the building was a masterclass in obfuscation. Holmes hired and fired contractors with dizzying frequency. He would refuse to pay builders, claiming subpar work, forcing them to walk off the job. He would then hire a new crew to complete the next phase. This constant turnover ensured that no single worker, architect, or municipal inspector ever possessed a complete understanding of the building's layout. The interior of the upper floors was an architectural anomaly designed entirely to disorient and control. It featured hallways that angled sharply and dead-ended into solid walls. There were staircases that led nowhere, doors that could only be locked from the outside, and rooms lined with iron plating and sound-dampening materials. He installed a walk-in bank vault, ostensibly for securing the valuables of his hotel guests and business partners, but it was fitted with a gas line controlled from his private office. Throughout the building, a network of chutes led directly from the upper floors to the basement, where Holmes had installed a large kiln and vats of corrosive chemicals. The true horror of Holmes's operation lay in his victimology and his motives. He did not operate like the sensationalized villains of fiction. His primary motivation was almost always financial. He preyed upon the very people who had come to Chicago seeking independence. Many of his victims were young women, whom he employed as stenographers or clerks. Women like Emmeline Sigrand and the sisters Minnie and Nanny Williams were drawn into his orbit by promises of employment, romance, and financial security. Holmes would convince them to transfer their savings, inheritances, or property deeds into his name. He would persuade them to take out life insurance policies, naming himself as the beneficiary. Once their financial assets were fully under his control, the victims simply vanished. In the late 19th century, a person's disappearance rarely triggered an immediate police investigation. There were no national databases, no social security numbers, and no digital footprints. If a young woman from a distant state stopped writing letters home, it was often assumed she had simply moved on, married, or lost touch. Holmes exploited this societal anonymity perfectly. He would tell inquiring relatives that the women had moved to Europe or California. Meanwhile, he engaged in a macabre secondary income stream. Utilizing his medical background, he would prepare the skeletal remains of his victims and sell them to medical schools and laboratories, passing them off as legally acquired anatomical specimens. In an era before strict regulations on the sourcing of medical cadavers, local institutions asked few questions about the origins of the perfectly articulated skeletons they purchased from the charismatic businessman. Despite his cunning, Holmes was not a criminal mastermind capable of sustaining his empire indefinitely. His operation was built on a fragile foundation of debt, unpaid creditors, and overlapping frauds. When the World's Fair concluded in the autumn of 1893, the massive influx of tourists stopped. The Chicago economy took a downturn, and Holmes's creditors began to close in. Facing imminent ruin and potential arrest for massive financial fraud, he abandoned the castle and fled Chicago, embarking on a cross-country journey that would ultimately lead to his downfall. It was not the complex architectural trap in Chicago that brought Holmes to justice, but a seemingly straightforward insurance scam in Philadelphia. In 1894, Holmes conspired with a longtime associate, a carpenter named Benjamin Pitezel. The plan was simple, or so Pitezel believed. Pitezel would take out a $10,000 life insurance policy with the Fidelity Mutual Life Association. They would then fake Pitezel's death using a stolen cadaver, collect the money, and split the proceeds, allowing Pitezel to reunite with his wife and 5 children under an assumed name. However, Holmes had calculated that securing a convincing cadaver was too difficult and carried too much risk. Instead, he made a cold, pragmatic decision. He murdered Benjamin Pitezel. Holmes rendered his associate unconscious, utilized a volatile chemical to ensure his demise, and then staged an explosion to make the death appear as a tragic workplace accident. Holmes then brazenly accompanied one of Pitezel's daughters to Philadelphia to identify the body, successfully claiming the insurance money. This act of profound betrayal was the beginning of the end. The Fidelity Mutual Life Association was highly suspicious of the claim. Insurance companies of the era were the pioneers of private investigation, often employing independent detectives to root out fraud. They noted discrepancies in the timeline and the unusual circumstances of the death. The company hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the most formidable law enforcement organization in the country at the time. The Pinkertons tracked Holmes across several states, eventually arresting him in Boston on an outstanding warrant for a minor horse swindling charge from Texas. With Holmes in custody, the true scope of the investigation began. The authorities in Philadelphia, led by District Attorney George Graham, realized that Benjamin Pitezel had indeed been murdered. But a far more pressing and tragic mystery emerged. 3 of Pitezel's children, Alice, Nellie, and young Howard, were missing. Holmes, speaking from his jail cell, offered a web of lies. He claimed the children were traveling with a mysterious associate, moving between boarding houses across the country. He insisted they were safe and would be produced shortly. The task of finding the missing children fell to a man who would become the true hero of this narrative, Philadelphia police detective Frank Geyer. Detective Geyer's investigation is a landmark in the history of law enforcement, a testament to relentless, methodical police work in an era devoid of modern technology. Geyer was not relying on wiretaps, DNA analysis, or surveillance cameras. He relied on his intellect, his physical endurance, and an unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth. Geyer's methodology was painstaking. He knew that Holmes, traveling with 3 children, would have needed to rent temporary lodging. He also knew that Holmes was inherently frugal and favored specific types of boarding houses. Armed with photographs of Holmes and the missing children, Geyer began retracing the killer's steps. He traveled by train to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he canvassed dozens of hotels, showing the photographs to clerks, baggage handlers, and real estate agents. He discovered that Holmes had indeed been there, renting a house, but had moved on quickly. The detective followed the trail to Indianapolis, Indiana, repeating the exhaustive process. Hundreds of interviews yielded a few confirmed sightings. The trail then led across the international border into Canada, to the city of Toronto. It was a daunting task. Toronto was a large, bustling city, and Geyer had to search for a needle in a haystack. He visited real estate offices, asking if anyone remembered a man matching Holmes's description who had rented a property for a very short period. Finally, his persistence paid off. He found a rental agent who recognized the photograph. The man had rented a house on St. Vincent Street. Geyer secured permission from the local Canadian authorities to search the property. The house was empty, but a neighbor recalled the man borrowing a shovel to dig in the cellar. Geyer and local police descended into the dark basement. They began to excavate the soft earth. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and dread. A few feet down, the detectives' worst fears were realized. The investigators located the remains of Alice and Nellie Pitezel. The forensic identification process that followed highlights the resourcefulness of 19th-century investigators. Without dental records in the modern sense, or DNA, identification relied on physical characteristics and personal effects. The mother of the girls was brought to Toronto. Through distinctive articles of clothing, a specific braided pattern in the hair, and unique anatomical markers that only a mother would know, the identities were tragically confirmed. But young Howard was still missing. Detective Geyer refused to stop. He deduced from train schedules and witness accounts that Holmes had separated the boy from his sisters prior to arriving in Toronto. Geyer traced Holmes's earlier movements back to the Indianapolis area, specifically to the quiet suburb of Irvington. Once again, he employed his methodical canvassing technique. He located a real estate agent who remembered renting a small cottage to the suspect. Geyer searched the Irvington property. In the cellar, concealed beneath the floorboards, investigators uncovered the remains of young Howard Pitezel. The meticulous, continent-spanning pursuit by Detective Frank Geyer had not only dismantled Holmes's web of lies, but had provided undeniable proof of his capacity for calculated murder. While Geyer was unearthing the tragedies in Canada and Indiana, the police in Chicago had finally entered the abandoned castle in Englewood. The investigation of the building was a complex and harrowing undertaking. Chicago police, accompanied by building inspectors, began to dismantle the structure from the inside out. They discovered the hidden rooms, the gas pipes connected to the vault, and the massive kiln in the basement. The forensic excavation of the castle's basement presented a monumental challenge. Investigators sifted through ashes and debris, recovering personal items, fragments of jewelry, and skeletal remains. In 1895, forensic anthropology was in its infancy. Determining the exact number of victims from commingled, heavily degraded remains was nearly impossible. The authorities called upon medical experts to analyze the findings. Through careful examination, they identified remains belonging to multiple individuals, including a child. They utilized early forms of forensic dentistry, matching dental work found in the ashes to the records of a local dentist who had treated some of the missing women. Despite the physical evidence recovered from the Chicago property, prosecuting Holmes for the crimes committed in the castle proved legally complex. The jurisdictional boundaries of the era meant that crimes committed in Illinois had to be prosecuted in Illinois. However, the evidence from Chicago was largely circumstantial, relying on fragmented remains and the complex financial trails of the missing women. The authorities recognized that the strongest, most undeniable case for a murder conviction lay in Philadelphia. In late 1895, H. Holmes stood trial in Philadelphia for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal scholars, and citizens captivated by the sheer magnitude of the investigation. The prosecution, led by District Attorney George Graham, presented a masterful, airtight case. They did not rely on the sensationalized rumors surrounding the Chicago castle. Instead, they focused entirely on the documented facts of the insurance fraud, the timeline of Holmes's movements, and the physical evidence of Pitezel's death. Medical experts took the stand to detail the autopsy of Benjamin Pitezel. They presented clinical evidence proving that the victim had been incapacitated with chloroform prior to the staging of the explosion. The forensic testimony dismantled Holmes's defense that the death was an accident or a suicide. Detective Frank Geyer also testified, laying out the meticulous paper trail of train tickets, hotel registries, and forged letters that proved Holmes had isolated and manipulated the Pitezel family. Throughout the trial, Holmes exhibited the classic traits of a malignant narcissist. He dismissed his highly capable defense attorneys and chose to represent himself. He clearly believed that his intellect and charm could outwit the prosecution and sway the jury. He cross-examined witnesses, including the grieving widow of Benjamin Pitezel, with a chilling lack of emotion. His performance in the courtroom, however, only served to highlight his arrogance and his complete detachment from the gravity of his actions. The jury saw through his articulate facade. It took them less than 3 hours of deliberation to return a verdict of guilty. The judge sentenced Herman Webster Mudgett, alias H. Holmes, to death by hanging. In the months leading up to his execution, Holmes engaged in a final, desperate attempt to control his narrative and profit from his notoriety. He sold his story to the Hearst newspaper syndicate for a substantial sum of money. In these published confessions, he claimed to have murdered over 27 individuals. However, historical and forensic analysis has shown that these confessions were riddled with contradictions, fabrications, and impossibilities. He claimed to have murdered people who were later found to be alive and living under new names. He altered the details of his crimes to suit the dramatic demands of the newspapers. The exact number of his victims remains unknown. While he confessed to 27, and sensationalist rumors at the time suggested hundreds, modern historians and forensic experts estimate the actual number of victims is likely between 9 and a dozen. This number, while lower than the myth, does not diminish the profound tragedy or the calculated cruelty of his actions. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was executed at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Even in his final moments, he demonstrated an obsession with control. Exhibiting a profound fear that his body would be stolen and sold to a medical school, a fate he had inflicted upon his own victims, he made a specific final request. He asked that his coffin be filled with cement and buried 10 feet underground. The authorities granted this request, ensuring that the man who had commodified the dead would remain securely in the earth. The investigation and trial of H. Holmes marked a significant turning point in American law enforcement. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a rapidly expanding, mobile society. It highlighted the critical need for interjurisdictional cooperation among police departments and paved the way for the centralization of criminal records. The meticulous work of Detective Frank Geyer demonstrated the power of methodical, evidence-based investigation over reliance on confessions or eyewitness testimony alone. The case also spurred advancements in forensic science, particularly in the use of dental records and the analysis of trace evidence, laying the groundwork for the scientific investigative techniques that would become standard practice in the 20th century. The story of the murder castle is often overshadowed by the myth of the man who built it. But the true focus of this history must remain on the victims and the relentless pursuit of justice. The people who lost their lives in Englewood were not merely characters in a macabre tale. They were ambitious, hopeful individuals who traveled to a booming city to partake in the American dream. They were sisters seeking independence, fathers trying to provide for their families, and young women embracing the opportunities of a new era. Their lives were cut short by a predator who exploited their trust and the anonymity of the modern metropolis. The legacy of this case is a testament to the resilience of those who seek the truth and a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a charismatic facade and a locked door. As we look back at the gleaming promise of the 1893 World's Fair and the shadows that lurked just miles away, one must wonder, in our highly connected modern world, have we truly eliminated the vulnerabilities that allow such deception to thrive, or have the predators simply adapted to a new architecture of anonymity?